The moment David steps into the hotel lobby, the world seems to shift ever so slightly. His polished shoes echo softly against the pristine marble floor, but in the split second that he crosses into the hotel's space, it's as if time slows. He's dressed impeccably, sharp suit, perfectly groomed. But it's not his appearance that Rebecca Miller, the front desk manager, is focused on. She's watching him with a narrowed gaze, the sharpness in her eyes betraying something deeper than the mere act of checking in. David approaches the desk, confident but aware that he's being scrutinized. As he steps closer, Rebecca's gaze doesn't quite meet his. Her eyes flicker over him quickly, like a scan, evaluating him as though he doesn't belong. Her lips curl into a tight, controlled smile, but there's something sinister beneath it. The smile doesn't quite reach her eyes. It's cold, calculating. Her head tilts ever so slightly to the side as she takes him in, a silent assessment. Her body language is the most telling. She crosses her arms as though she's already put him in a box, the motion deliberate, dismissive. She leans back just a little too far from the counter, like his very presence is contaminating the polished, curated air of the lobby. It's a simple movement, but it carries weight. Her posture screams, "I've already decided who you are." The way her fingers lightly tap the desk, a rhythmic, almost impatient motion, conveys more than just irritation. It's disdain. It's as though she's waiting for David to prove himself worthy of being there, but in her eyes, he already has no place.
Rebecca doesn't just speak to him. She delivers her words like a judgment, a verdict before the trial has even begun. Her voice is smooth, condescending, dripping with the kind of thinly veiled sarcasm only someone with a superiority complex would use. "Do you have a reservation, Mr. Thompson?" The words sound polite, but her tone makes it clear that she's not genuinely interested in confirming his booking. The question feels more like an accusation than an inquiry. The slight twitch of her eyebrow, the almost imperceptible roll of her eyes, says everything about her mindset. She doesn't believe he's here for anything legitimate. She's already pegged him as an imposter, as someone unworthy of the luxury surrounding them. It's not just the question she asks, it's how she frames it. By the way she says, "Mr. Thompson," it's clear she's not seeing him as a guest, but as a problem. Rebecca's subtle gestures, how she moves a few inches back, the crossing of her arms, the slight purse of her lips, build an invisible wall between herself and David. This isn't just about a simple hotel check-in, it's about her perception of his place in this world, a world of wealth, exclusivity, and, she believes, entitlement. Her unspoken actions carry judgment that goes beyond the surface, suggesting that she's already written him off as someone who doesn't belong in this space, someone who doesn't belong in her space.
As she waits for him to answer, the tension builds in the air, thick with unspoken expectations. David feels it too, this undercurrent of something more sinister, something personal. The way Rebecca holds herself, the way she scrutinizes his every movement, makes it clear this encounter won't be ordinary. It's not just a question of whether David will check in, it's a question of whether he can break through the barrier of judgment that's already been placed upon him. The audience feels it too. The tension is palpable. Rebecca's judgment, not just of David's outward appearance, but of his very right to be there, reverberates through the lobby. It's a silent accusation, one that drips with the weight of something much deeper than a simple interaction.
Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. I have missed you all, missed all the experiences we've had together. I need your support on YouTube now more than ever. Thank you especially for sticking around to this very moment. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. And if you won't subscribe, kindly tell us why in the comment section. We would love to know. Now, back to the story.
As the scene unfolds, the tension in the lobby is unmistakable. David, standing at the center of it all, feels the invisible weight of the eyes upon him. He's not just dealing with Rebecca anymore, he's become the focus of a growing crowd. Their reactions, though not voiced, reverberate through the space, amplifying the conflict. Some guests glance surreptitiously over the tops of their phones. Others shift uncomfortably in their seats, but all of them sense something isn't right. There's a subtle shift in energy as Rebecca's condescending tone rises, and the guests, who were once absorbed in their own quiet worlds, become aware of the drama unfolding. A businessman, his coffee cup trembling slightly in his hand, watches the interaction unfold with a furrowed brow. His gaze moves from Rebecca to David, then back to Rebecca, and there's an uncomfortable hesitation in his expression, as if he's weighing whether to intervene or simply remain a passive observer. He can't help but notice how Rebecca's treatment of David doesn't match the polite demeanor one would expect in such a high-end establishment. His discomfort is clear, but he remains silent, unsure how to respond, caught between the crowd's unspoken expectations and his own sense of right and wrong. A young woman nearby, phone raised and streaming live to her followers, watches with increasing disbelief. Her fingers hover over the screen, caught between capturing the moment and processing it. The soft murmur of whispers rises around her as the number of viewers on her feed increases, confirming what the guests already feel deep down. This isn't just a simple case of mistaken identity, it's a case of prejudice in plain sight. As the scene progresses, her face slowly shifts from curiosity to outrage, but her desire to document the unfolding injustice keeps her rooted in place. She watches not just as a bystander, but as someone who recognizes the unfairness happening before her eyes.
Some guests, uncomfortable with the mounting tension, try to retreat into themselves. They turn their attention away, pretending not to notice, yet they can't seem to escape the growing discomfort of the moment. Their glances linger too long, their movements stilted, as if they know something is wrong but lack the courage to speak up. The awkwardness hangs thick in the air. The polished marble floors beneath their feet seem to echo louder, their uncomfortable shuffling punctuating the growing unease. It's as if the lobby, once a place of comfort and luxury, has suddenly turned cold and unwelcoming. But there are also those who can't help but take sides. A middle-aged couple stands at the concierge desk, glancing over with subtle expressions of disbelief. Their gaze shifts from David to Rebecca, their eyes narrowing. They begin to sense the inequality in Rebecca's actions, and without a word exchanged, they start to exchange glances with others in the lobby, silently joining the growing awareness of what's unfolding. They may not vocalize their discomfort, but in their looks, there's a shared understanding. What's happening here is wrong. As Rebecca's voice rises, those around her start to feel the emotional impact of her words. The businessman's once steadfast posture falters, his discomfort turning to unease. The young woman's phone continues to stream, her audience growing, and with it, the realization that this moment is no longer just about David and Rebecca. It's become a public spectacle, drawing attention from everyone in the room. The guests, once passive bystanders, can no longer ignore the injustice. Some fidget nervously, unsure how to react. Others stare at the scene in disbelief, as though waiting for the moment when someone, anyone, will step in and stop the escalating tension. But no one moves, and the silence becomes louder than any word spoken.
The audience, though still mostly silent, is no longer passive. Their shifting glances, their discomfort, their reluctance to intervene, they all serve to heighten the emotional weight of the moment. David is no longer alone in his struggle. The audience of guests, whether they're aware of it or not, are now part of the unfolding drama. Their discomfort becomes an emotional echo that amplifies the injustice David faces. It's no longer just Rebecca's actions that feel wrong, it's the collective inaction of those watching.
all sensing something deeply unjust, yet all remaining frozen, unwilling to confront the truth head-on. David stands at the center of the storm, unwavering. As Rebecca's words slice through the air, full of contempt and judgment, he doesn't flinch. He doesn't raise his voice or react to the indignity of the moment. His silence isn't the absence of response. It's a deliberate choice, a quiet defiance that speaks volumes. Every word Rebecca hurls at him bounces off, and with each passing second, the space around him grows heavier, more charged. His calmness, so unnerving in the face of such hostility, creates a stark contrast to the tension crackling in the air. There's something deeply compelling in his restraint, something that both unnerves and captivates. His posture, perfectly composed, doesn't betray a single flicker of anger or fear. He stands straight, his shoulders square, but there's an intensity in the stillness of his body. His eyes remain fixed on Rebecca, not with the challenge you might expect, but with an almost detached curiosity, as if he's watching a performance he knows will soon implode. This isn't a man on the defensive, but one who understands the depth of what's unfolding. His stillness commands attention, and the longer it stretches, the more the tension amplifies. As Rebecca grows louder, her words tinged with venom, David remains the calm at the center of the storm. His silence is almost like a pressure building inside the room. It's not just the absence of speech, it's the anticipation of a storm that hasn't yet broken. The audience, caught between curiosity and discomfort, can feel it too. There's something unnerving about how he's choosing not to engage, as if he's playing a long game, waiting for the right moment to strike. His calmness isn't passive, it's a shield, a quiet power that draws all the attention towards him. The more Rebecca seethes, the more his quiet strength becomes an undeniable force. Every word that drips from her mouth only fuels the undercurrent of suspense. The longer he holds his ground, the greater the emotional weight becomes. It's clear he's not intimidated, he's not rattled, and the longer he stays composed, the more it feels like a ticking clock. Viewers feel the rising tension, drawn into the magnetic force of his silence. His calmness forces them to lean in, anticipating when and how this calm will be shattered. It's in the way he doesn't rush to explain, doesn't scramble to prove himself. He knows the truth doesn't need defense. The weight of his restraint speaks louder than any words he could say. His presence in that moment is as potent as any confrontation, leaving the audience hanging on the edge of their seats, wondering how far Rebecca will push, and whether David will break, or whether, somehow, she will.
This quiet defiance is what hooks the viewer. It's a slow burn, not an explosive outburst, but a quiet rebellion that simmers just beneath the surface. And with every passing second, it becomes clearer. David's silence isn't weakness, it's his strength. David's mind drifts, the sterile brightness of the hotel lobby fading into the shadows of his past. The years slip away, and suddenly he's a boy again, small, unsure, standing in front of a worn-out schoolhouse. It's a humid day, but the air feels thick, like it always did when he was younger, walking the long path home after school. At just 8 years old, he learned that the world wasn't going to meet him with open arms. The stares, the whispers, they followed him like a shadow that never let him go. The first moment hit when he was just a kid, sitting in class, his hand raised eagerly to answer a question. The teacher called on him, but when he spoke, she interrupted him mid-sentence, ignoring the sincerity in his words. It wasn't what he'd said. It was who he was that she couldn't bear to listen to. A chuckle spread through the class. A few kids snickered, and he could feel the sting of their eyes on him. That's when it started. The idea that maybe he wasn't supposed to be in certain spaces, that perhaps the world he dreamed of wasn't meant for someone like him. But he didn't cry. He'd never let them see him cry. He just tightened his grip on the pencil in his hand and learned early that to be noticed, he would have to be better than the assumptions, the slights, and the quiet laughter that trailed behind him.
Flash forward to high school. David stood on the basketball court, his sneakers squeaking against the polished wood. He'd worked relentlessly to make the team, running drills until his legs burned, practicing late into the evening when no one was watching. And when he finally made the starting lineup, there was no fanfare. The coach didn't look him in the eye when he handed him the uniform, just a quick nod, as if it was expected. The guys on the team? They didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for him either. There were the cold shoulder glances, the occasional whispered joke when he passed by. It wasn't overt, not at first, but the message was clear. He was just the token kid, the one who made them look good, but was never truly one of them. That was the way it worked, and David had learned to deal with it the only way he knew how, by excelling, by being the best player on the court. He didn't need their acceptance. He just needed to prove that he belonged. It wasn't just at school. At home, David felt the weight of expectations, his parents' quiet hopes and quiet fears. His mother, ever strong, always spoke about how hard they had to work to be seen as equal, to be seen as worthy. She told him stories of what it meant to stand tall in a world that would try to keep you down, and how dignity wasn't given, it was earned, carved out of every battle, every moment of silence in the face of injustice. But even she couldn't shield him from the world outside. At his first job, working the late-night shift at a diner, David met more of the same. He remembered the old man who would sit at the counter every week, his eyes always a little too sharp, his words always a little too quick. "You're doing a good job, son, for someone like you," the man would say, his tone a mix of surprise and condescension. David would smile, bite his tongue, and pour another cup of coffee. He wasn't there to change anyone's mind. He was there to survive, to make it through another day. But those little moments, those glances, those offhand comments built something inside him. They carved out the resolve that would eventually become his greatest asset.
It wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about proving himself right. Every time someone doubted him, every time they looked past him or assumed he wasn't enough, David dug in deeper. His drive wasn't just fueled by ambition. It was driven by the need to make the world see him as he was, a force to be reckoned with, but more importantly, a person worthy of respect, dignity, and the right to stand beside anyone, anywhere, without apology. And so, as the years passed, that quiet fire began to burn inside him. He wasn't just striving for success, he was striving for something far greater, the right to occupy a space without being questioned, the right to exist fully without the need for validation, the kind of success that wasn't just measured by titles or wealth, but by the way he could stand tall in the face of judgment and the dignity that came with leading by example. Now, sitting in this hotel lobby, the weight of his past settles around him. Those moments, those small slights, they've all led him here. The world hasn't changed, not really, but David has, and that's why he stands there, poised and composed, ready for whatever comes next. The world has no idea who he truly is, not yet, but it's only a matter of time before they learn. David's journey wasn't just a climb. It was a constant, unyielding battle against every obstacle that tried to hold him back. The streets he walked growing up weren't lined with opportunities, but with challenges that pushed him harder with each step. It wasn't just the lack of wealth or privilege that marked his early life. It was the perception that he was never meant to succeed, never meant to reach the heights he would one day conquer. As a child, David never looked around and saw anyone who looked like him in positions of power, never saw faces that reflected his own in boardrooms or offices. Those dreams, those aspirations felt distant. His parents, immigrants from a small town, had built their lives from nothing. His father worked tirelessly at a mechanic shop while his mother cleaned houses, always striving to instill in David the values of hard work, integrity, and humility. But as much as they tried, there was always that underlying feeling, the idea that their son would have to work 10 times harder just to be seen as equal.
David carried that weight with him through high school and college, always pushing harder than the rest. His friends, comfortable with their privileges, didn't understand why he spent long nights studying, sacrificing weekends to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. But David knew. He wasn't just getting by, he was building something. Every hour spent in the library, every grueling shift at the diner, wasn't just about earning money. It was about creating a future that wasn't dictated by anyone's assumptions about him. It was about carving a path where no one could say he didn't belong. By the time David finished college, his resolve had already hardened into steel. He was no longer the kid from a small, forgotten neighborhood. He was a man with purpose. But that didn't mean the struggle was over. Far from it. The corporate world had its own set of rules, its own unspoken biases, and David quickly learned that merit wasn't always enough. He had to prove himself, not once, but over and over again. His first job at a mid-level company wasn't glamorous, but he threw himself into it with a determination that left no room for failure. The hours were long, the expectations high, but David kept moving, focused on the end game. As he rose through the ranks, every promotion came with a cost. Friends became distant as David buried himself deeper in his work. Relationships were strained, his personal life a distant second to the climb. Holidays were spent in offices rather than with family. The quiet sacrifices became the foundation of his success. He'd missed countless birthdays, anniversaries, and milestones. Each decision to push forward rather than take a break, to give more than what was expected, was made with the quiet understanding that the road to the top required everything.
But David wasn't just climbing to reach the top. He was climbing to change what the top looked like. He saw how the corporate world worked, how it favored the privileged, the connected, the ones with resources that others could only dream of. And David, he didn't have those resources. But he had something else, a drive that couldn't be bought, a resolve that couldn't be shaken. When he made his way to Grandview Hotels, his vision wasn't just about leading a company, it was about building something different, something better. He wasn't content with simply being a successful businessman. David wanted to create a company that valued people over profit, that recognized the worth of every individual, regardless of their background, race, or financial status. His hiring decisions, his corporate culture, everything he did was designed to foster inclusion. He built a team where every person, no matter their past, had an equal shot at success. The idea was simple, yet powerful. Success should be built on merit, not privilege. Every person should have the opportunity to rise based on their abilities, not their connections. But creating that culture wasn't easy. It required constant effort, constant vigilance. There were setbacks, pushback from executives, resistance from staff who weren't used to this new way of thinking. And then there was the constant pressure of proving to the world that someone who looked like him, who came from where he did, could lead with authority and integrity. The weight of that responsibility rested heavily on David's shoulders. He knew that if he failed, it wouldn't just be a personal failure. It would be a failure for everyone who'd ever been overlooked, underestimated, or disregarded.
Still, he pressed on. Late nights, endless meetings, difficult conversations, David didn't stop. With each hurdle he cleared, with each win he claimed for his vision, he proved that his success wasn't a fluke. It was the result of years of sacrifice,
determination, and belief in something greater than himself. And in the process, he built a legacy, not just for himself, but for everyone who ever believed that success could be achieved on their own terms. Now, as CEO of Grandview Hotels, David stood at the pinnacle of everything he'd worked for. But even as he surveyed the empire he'd built, he never forgot the cost. The friends he'd lost, the moments he'd missed, he knew that success had come at a price. But the company he'd created, the culture he'd built, made it all worth it. He wasn't just running a hotel empire, he was leading a movement. And in that moment, as the weight of the past pressed on him, David knew that every sacrifice, every late night, every single challenge he had overcome had led him to this point. Not just as a CEO, but as someone who had changed the rules of the game. David wasn't just a boss. He was the kind of leader who led by example. His team at Grandview Hotels wasn't just a collection of employees. They were the embodiment of the values he had spent years building. Every decision he made, every meeting he sat through, was rooted in the belief that true success didn't come from cutthroat competition. It came from collaboration, respect, and opportunity for all. When he sat down with Michael Brown, the general manager, it wasn't just about the bottom line. It was about the bigger picture. Michael had been with the company for years, and over time, he had come to understand David's vision. But David never took that understanding for granted. He never assumed that just because Michael had been loyal, he would automatically align with the values David held dear. Instead, he made it clear, each time they met, that their shared success wasn't just measured by profit margins, it was measured by how much they improved people's lives, both inside and outside of the company.
David's approach wasn't one of intimidation, but of trust and transparency. In their weekly strategy meetings, Michael had learned to appreciate David's quiet but firm leadership style. Where others might have bulldozed their way through decisions, David always took a moment to listen, really listen, to every point of view. He'd ask questions, not to challenge, but to ensure everyone felt heard. And then, once all the perspectives were on the table, he would make his decision. Not based on what was easiest or most profitable, but based on what was fair and inclusive. "Michael," David would say in those meetings, his voice calm but carrying the weight of years of experience, "this hotel can't thrive on exclusion. If we're only serving one type of guest, we're missing out on something much bigger. We need to meet people where they are, not where we think they should be." Michael had seen it time and time again. David wasn't just concerned about making money, though he certainly knew how to do that. He was committed to creating an environment where every guest, no matter their background or social standing, felt welcome. That was what made Grandview different. It wasn't just about luxury, it was about access. Lisa Anderson, the head of HR, was another key player who understood David's vision. Lisa had worked for many different companies in her career, but David's approach to people was unlike any she had encountered. He didn't see HR as just a department to manage complaints. He saw it as the heart of the company. Every decision she made had to align with David's belief that everyone, from the housekeeping staff to the executive team, should have equal opportunity to succeed. But David didn't just talk about inclusivity, he embedded it into the very fabric of Grandview's operations.
During a quarterly staff meeting, David looked around the room at his team, managers, supervisors, and department heads, all eager for guidance. He had a way of making even the most routine discussions feel like an invitation to change the world. "We've built something special here," David began, his voice steady and firm. "But we can't stop at just hiring diverse talent. That's just the first step. We need to ensure our environment is one where everyone can thrive. A place where merit, hard work, and character outweigh all else." Lisa, who had been with David since the beginning, was always struck by how he made his expectations clear without ever raising his voice. He didn't rely on fear to lead. He relied on respect. His staff worked for him because they wanted to, not because they had to. He made them feel valued, like they were crucial to the company's success. And in turn, they gave him their best work, their dedication, and their loyalty. He set high expectations, yes, but they weren't arbitrary. They were grounded in fairness, inclusivity, and the unwavering belief that everyone had the potential to rise if given the right tools and the chance. David didn't tolerate mediocrity, but he also didn't tolerate anyone being left behind. Every employee had a voice, every department had a seat at the table, and no one, no matter their position, was ever overlooked. In their one-on-one conversations, David often asked Michael and Lisa questions that went beyond the usual metrics. How do you think we're doing when it comes to creating opportunities for everyone, not just the ones at the top? He'd ask. Are we doing enough to make sure people feel like they belong here?
It was these conversations that defined David's leadership, his willingness to challenge himself and his team to keep improving. And that commitment to fairness didn't just trickle down from the top, it was woven into the very culture of Grandview. David wasn't interested in making a quick profit at the expense of integrity. Instead, he wanted to build a company that would last, one where people felt valued, not just as employees, but as human beings. David's influence was clear not just in the policies he implemented, but in the day-to-day actions of his team. When a guest walked into any Grandview hotel, they didn't just experience luxury. They experienced a place that understood them, a place that made them feel seen and respected. It was that dedication to inclusivity, that deep-seated belief in the value of every individual that became the backbone of the company's success. And it was all because of David. He knew that true leadership wasn't about power. It was about people. It was about giving others the tools they needed to succeed and then stepping back, allowing them to rise. By setting the standard for inclusivity and fairness, David had not only built a successful company, he had built a family, one where everyone, from the top down, felt like they belonged. In those moments with his team, whether it was a strategy session or a quiet conversation after hours, David's values were crystal clear. His commitment to inclusivity wasn't just something he talked about, it was something he lived every single day. And because of that, Grandview Hotels was more than just a business. It was a reflection of who he was and what he believed in. And in the end, that's what would set them apart in a world that often valued profit over people.
David had always known. It wasn't that the issues within Grandview Hotels were hidden. It was that they were subtle, woven into the daily interactions that most people overlooked. At first, he tried to tell himself they were just isolated incidents, a single offhand remark from a guest here, a dismissive comment from an employee there. But as time went on, it became clear. These were not isolated moments. They were a pattern. In the early days of his tenure as CEO, David would walk the halls of each of Grandview's properties, moving through the crowds unnoticed, observing how the staff interacted with guests. At one of the flagship locations, he overheard a conversation between two front desk employees. One was a young woman, eager and bright, trying to find a way to help an elderly guest who had a slight accent. The other, an older employee who had been with the hotel for years, shot a look at the guest and muttered under his breath, "She'll never understand us." The young woman, trying to smooth over the situation, had no idea her colleague's words cut deeper than the surface. David had heard enough. In a rare, quiet moment in the office, he had a private conversation with the older employee. "It's not about them," David said softly, leaning forward. "It's about us, what we stand for. We're a company that stands for inclusivity. We don't have the luxury of clinging to old ways of thinking. Everyone deserves respect, no matter where they're from or how they speak." The employee tried to offer an excuse, but David's gaze made it clear that this wasn't up for debate. "This is bigger than just this hotel or this guest. It's about our brand. And if you can't align with that, we'll have to find someone who does." The conversation was direct, but David knew how to balance firmness with understanding, making sure the staff knew the boundaries without feeling condemned. David didn't stop there. He was relentless, watching for the small moments, the quiet biases that festered beneath the polished exterior. A hotel manager at a sister property once made a joke about suspicious-looking guests based on their dress, their skin color, and their accent. It wasn't said aloud to anyone but David, but it was enough for him to act. In private, he called the manager into his office, where the conversation began with a single question. "Do you think we can afford to have such ideas under our roof?" The manager stammered a response, trying to justify the remark. But David was already 3 steps ahead. "This isn't a question of right or wrong. This is about the future of this company. A future where the guests you turn away based on assumptions are the same guests we've worked so hard to earn the trust of. Do you think I'm building this empire to shut out people based on where they come from? Because that's not the world I'm leading." There were no threats, no ultimatums, just truth. The manager left the room with a new understanding of where he stood, and David quietly made sure the necessary diversity training took place. It wasn't the grand gestures that mattered. It was these quiet, often unseen moments that defined the company's culture.
David's awareness of the underlying issues didn't stop there. On a trip to a property in Florida, he heard murmurs from employees about a well-known local charity event that excluded people of color. He could hear the awkwardness in their voices, the way they tried to rationalize the status quo. But David couldn't ignore it. He called a meeting with the event organizers, and with a calm, deliberate presence, he told them, "You're either with us in creating opportunities for everyone, or you're not. And if you're not, we don't partner." The event organizers were stunned, but David didn't back down. "You don't get to run a hotel chain like ours with outdated beliefs. If that's your stance, we'll find another way to give back to the community. One that's inclusive, one that reflects who we are." Each of these incidents was dealt with privately, often without fanfare, and many employees never knew the depth of David's involvement. He didn't need to make it public, because his approach was never about grandstanding. It was about quietly resetting the culture, about making sure every employee, from housekeeping to management, understood what Grandview stood for. But despite his efforts, the tension had been building. These quiet battles, these underlying prejudices had been simmering beneath the surface. David's insistence on fairness had reshaped many attitudes, but not all. He knew that it was only a matter of time before something larger would shake the foundation of the company, revealing just how deep the roots of discrimination ran.
And now, standing in the hotel lobby, David felt that familiar weight settle in his chest. He could sense it, the air thick with anticipation. This wasn't just another incident. This was the culmination of everything he had worked for and everything he had tried to prevent. It was no longer something he could quietly fix behind the scenes. The foundation of what he had built was about to be tested in the most public way possible. In that moment, David knew. This was the breaking point. He had been preparing for this day, even if he hadn't known when it would come. The company's values, the culture he'd painstakingly developed, would either survive or collapse here, in this lobby. The stakes were higher than ever, and David was ready to face the consequences of years of quiet efforts. What he didn't know, though, was how deeply this moment would test his resolve. The calm that had defined him in the past, it was now a quiet storm, waiting to unleash.
Rebecca Miller couldn't mask her surprise when David approached the counter, but it wasn't the kind of surprise one might expect in a luxury hotel. It wasn't the kind that came with a smile or a welcoming gesture. No, her surprise was sharp, jarring.
Her eyes flickered over him, scanning him as if he was an anomaly that didn't quite fit the polished surroundings. She hadn't been prepared for this, whatever this was. Her brow furrowed, and in that split second she sized him up. His suit, his watch, his calm demeanor, all of it felt out of place in her world of carefully curated expectations. David's politeness seemed to irritate her more than it should have. Her smile was thin, forced, barely masking the condescension in her voice. "Can I help you?" she asked, her words dripping with sarcasm. The question wasn't genuine, it was a challenge. It was as though she was daring him to prove he was worthy of being there. She didn't even bother to make eye contact at first, her gaze sliding down to the computer screen in front of her, as if checking her own reservation system was more important than acknowledging the guest standing in front of her. David's response, steady and polite, didn't seem to faze her. "I have a reservation under the name Thompson." His voice was calm, with no hint of frustration. He wasn't angry, wasn't defensive. In fact, he wasn't reacting at all. He was simply being. But Rebecca couldn't stand it. Her fingers tightened slightly on the keyboard as she typed his name into the system, but her expression shifted. She wasn't searching for his reservation. She was searching for a reason to dismiss him. The flicker of disbelief didn't fade from her face, and in her mind, he was the one out of place. When the confirmation appeared on her screen, her eyes lingered on it for a second too long, as if expecting the system to fail her and prove her judgment right. Her lips twitched in irritation when it didn't. Instead of acknowledging the reservation, she let out a tight laugh, one that wasn't amused but dismissive, almost theatrical. "Thompson," she repeated, as if testing the name on her tongue, like it was some sort of clever ploy. How original. David, still composed, didn't let the comment land. He simply stood there, unwavering. His calmness, his composure, it didn't play into her narrative. She wanted him to react, wanted him to show his cards, to get defensive or uncomfortable. Instead, he just was. His politeness, his lack of aggression, it wasn't just an inconvenience to her, it frustrated her. It made her question herself, made her feel like she wasn't in control of the situation the way she was used to being. Rebecca's fingers drummed impatiently on the counter. She looked him up and down again, her eyes narrowing. Her posture stiffened, and she leaned back slightly, as if distancing herself from him, though she was the one behind the desk. Her body language screamed judgment. She was still sizing him up, and in her mind, she had already concluded he didn't belong. She'd seen countless guests walk through those doors, guests who fit her idea of who should be here. And David Thompson, well, he didn't fit the mold. "You know," she said, her tone becoming even sharper, "the lobby's that way." She motioned lazily toward the grand seating area, but her gaze never left him. It was an almost imperceptible insult, disguised as a suggestion. Her words weren't an invitation. They were an attempt to push him out of her space, to make him feel less than.
David, without missing a beat, responded. "I'd prefer to check in here," he said, the words measured but clear, steady under the pressure of her dismissiveness. Rebecca's laugh was louder this time, bordering on condescending. "Sure you do," she said, the sarcasm thick in her voice. She didn't need to look at him to know how out of place he was. Another scammer, trying to con his way into the penthouse suite. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and she waited, expecting David to flinch, to show weakness. But he didn't. Instead, David's voice remained even, calm, and the tiniest flicker of something, dignity, passed between them. His poise was a silent refusal to bow to her assumptions, to her judgment. Rebecca's irritation bubbled just beneath the surface. She shifted her weight, crossing her arms tighter against her chest. The shift in her posture was subtle but deliberate, closing off, almost daring him to challenge her. She had already decided who he was, what he represented, and this moment wasn't about him,
It was about her controlling the narrative, about her making him fit her image of what people like him were supposed to be. David, however, refused to be swept up in her game. His politeness, which she had hoped to weaponize against him, only seemed to frustrate her more. She was used to people breaking under pressure, to showing some form of emotion. His restraint, however, was a force in itself, one that caught her off guard. With every word, every calm response, David's presence became a quiet challenge to everything Rebecca had believed about who deserved to occupy space in places like this.
And as the seconds stretched on, Rebecca's discomfort grew. Even if she wouldn't show it, she wanted to force him to react. She wanted to push him to reveal something beneath that calm exterior. But David remained immovable, his gaze steady, his composure perfect. And in that silence, the tension grew, until the moment Rebecca realized the power was slipping from her grasp. She could feel it. Every moment of her dismissiveness, every subtle put-down, it was all bouncing off him. And the realization was stark. David Thompson wasn't the one out of place. She was. The marble lobby, once a picture of serene luxury, now felt anything but calm. The soft murmur of distant conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the quiet hum of the chandelier overhead seemed to fade into the background as the standoff between David and Rebecca played out in full view of everyone present. Guests moved quietly, casting furtive glances in David's direction, their eyes flicking between him and Rebecca like they were watching a slow-motion car crash that they couldn't look away from. One by one, the eyes of the room turned toward the growing scene. A businessman, his suit sharply pressed and his briefcase clutched a little too tightly, took a long sip from his coffee, but his hand was visibly trembling. His gaze darted from David's composed figure to Rebecca's increasingly agitated stance. He quickly looked away, but not before his brow furrowed in confusion, his discomfort rippling through the room like a silent wave. Was this really happening? Was it just a misunderstanding? Or was something more insidious unfolding before their eyes? His glance lingered just a second too long on Rebecca as she leaned over the desk, her voice sharp, dismissive, as if David wasn't even worthy of the same courtesy extended to the other guests. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his coffee now lukewarm and forgotten.
A woman at the concierge desk, clutching her phone with the same nervous energy, raised it slightly, capturing the scene, her lips pressed into a tight line. She was trying to play it off, but her fingers shook, and she lowered the phone just enough to glance at the growing crowd. She wasn't alone in her unease. She could feel it in the air, the discomfort that was thickening with each passing second. She tried to pull her attention back to her screen, pretending not to notice the tension building in the room, but her eyes kept flicking back to David, who stood there, calmly demanding to be treated with respect, and to Rebecca, who looked ready to explode. A couple, sitting near the elevators, exchanged silent glances, their lips barely moving, but their eyes wide. They shifted closer together, as if their proximity might offer some protection from the undercurrent of hostility in the lobby. The man leaned in to whisper something to his companion, but his words were lost in the murmur of the room. His gaze flickered nervously between David and Rebecca, the silence growing heavier by the second. He wanted to look away, to forget this moment, but something in David's stillness, his unwavering composure, kept drawing him back. There was a deep, almost palpable discomfort now in the way the guests watched, and though no one spoke, the collective tension seemed to hang over them like a dark cloud. Across the room, a young couple, newly arrived and clearly out of place in the grand setting, watched from the periphery. They weren't used to this kind of environment, and the unease was evident in their glances. They exchanged an awkward look, unsure whether to react or remain quiet. Their unease wasn't just in the tension of the moment, but in the uncertainty of whether they were witnessing something they didn't fully understand. Was David being treated this way because of a simple mistake, or was there something deeper at play? Their eyes shifted, unsure where to land, between the face of Rebecca, tightening with every moment, and David's calm, almost serene composure. His silence was a stark contrast to the escalating confrontation, and that only made it more jarring. It felt like something had snapped, even if they weren't sure what it was.
A pair of elderly guests, seated near the grand staircase, exchanged an uncomfortable glance, their hands clutching their walking canes as they looked between David and Rebecca. Their expressions were soft but clearly troubled. The older man whispered something to his wife, and though no one could hear the words, it was clear they both felt the weight of the moment. They were too far removed from the confrontation to intervene, but the unease was palpable in their eyes, darting between the two figures like a tennis match. Rebecca's haughty posture, David's steady resistance. It wasn't hard to see that the older couple felt something wasn't right, something deeper than just a simple mix-up at the front desk. A woman, seated in the lounge area, had been silently reading a book until she noticed the scene unfolding at the front desk. Her gaze flickered up, drawn by Rebecca's increasingly sharp words. She tried to refocus on the pages, but her eyes kept darting back. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew enough to see that it was wrong. Her hand hovered over her phone, unsure whether to record the scene unfolding or simply let it pass. But she couldn't. She couldn't turn a blind eye to it. She knew the moment wasn't just about a simple check-in. It was about something much larger, something she couldn't ignore. With every passing second, the tension in the air grew thicker. It wasn't just an argument. It was a moment that felt like it was about to change something. The entire room, now silently observing, had become part of the unfolding drama. Even those who didn't want to get involved couldn't ignore the growing weight of discomfort pressing down on them. Their eyes moved, shifting back and forth between David and Rebecca. Some glanced away. Others leaned in closer, but no one was unaffected. The scene wasn't just about the words being exchanged. It was about the uncomfortable realization that what was happening was bigger than any of them could fully comprehend in that moment. The room was electric with unspoken tension, and no one knew how it would end, but it was clear this moment was going to leave its mark on everyone who witnessed it.
As Rebecca's words sliced through the air, the quiet murmur of the lobby seemed to shift. The soft hum of the chandeliers, the clink of glasses from the bar area, and the rustle of clothing faded into a dull background buzz. It was as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. When she dismissed David with a sharp, dismissive wave of her hand, the sound of her heels, clicking, echoed through the room. The sharp staccato beat of her footsteps, each one more deliberate than the last, underscored the growing divide between her and David. Each click seemed to punctuate her words, building an invisible wall around them. David remained still, unaffected by the noise, his calm presence like an anchor in the midst of the storm. But the rest of the room, the tension spread. It wasn't just Rebecca's words anymore. It was the subtle rise in sound that seemed to amplify everything. A phone camera snapped somewhere to David's right, a harsh, digital sound cutting through the space like a sudden flash of light. It was jarring, out of place, yet it was part of this quiet unraveling. The camera shutter caught the moment, freezing it in time, the click loud against the tension, as if the world was now documenting what was unfolding. As the moment stretched, the space in the lobby began to feel tighter. What once felt like a grand, open room with its gleaming floors and high ceilings now seemed to close in on David, as though the air itself had thickened, every noise amplified, every gaze a weight. The distant murmurs of nearby conversations, once a quiet background hum,
were now sharp and invasive, rising in volume. People's voices, once polite and indistinct, now seemed louder, unnaturally so, as if the pressure in the room was forcing their words out into the open, into the space between David and Rebecca.
A woman, sitting near the entrance, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her purse slipping from her lap with a soft thud against the marble floor. The noise seemed to reverberate, magnifying in the oppressive atmosphere. Her gaze flicked nervously between David and Rebecca, her hand instinctively reaching down to pick up her purse. She was avoiding looking at the confrontation, but the sound of her movement, the clink of metal against the floor, made it impossible for her to ignore what was happening. Everyone could feel it now, even those who tried to look away. The room was alive with tension, each sound acting like a magnifying glass, focusing on the growing conflict. And then, the phone camera shuttered again. Click. The sound came from somewhere behind David, louder this time. It was as if the entire room had fallen into sync with the escalation. The clicking of Rebecca's heels on the floor, the rustling of shifting bodies, and the sharp click of cameras, all of it built to a crescendo. The volume of everything, even the faintest noises, was creeping up, each one a sharp jab into the already thick silence that wrapped around David and Rebecca. David, calm as ever, stood unfazed by the noise, but the room around him seemed to hum with energy. The space felt alive with discomfort, each sound an intrusion into what was supposed to be a peaceful hotel lobby. The marble floor, once an elegant testament to luxury, now felt cold, pressing in on him, the very air thick with anticipation. The once quiet hum of the hotel, filled with routine noises, had turned into a cacophony of unease. Even the buzzing of the overhead lights seemed more pronounced, like the building itself was waiting for the storm to break.
Rebecca's voice cut through the noise, but even her words seemed drowned out by the intensity of the atmosphere. She was still speaking, her words sharp, but they now felt like a distant echo in a space that had become too small to contain her anger. Every word she threw at David seemed amplified, and her actions, each dismissive gesture, became more exaggerated, louder in the silence that followed. David didn't break his stance. His quiet, unshaken presence, even as the sound in the room pressed in on him, was the only thing that held the space together. The moment stretched, the buzz of the lobby now almost deafening. The ticking of the clock above the desk, the whispers behind David's back, and the click of heels on the floor all felt like they were converging toward a singular moment, one that would break the tension wide open. The space had become suffocating, a pressure cooker with no release, until it did. And just like that, the air seemed to snap. The confrontation, though still escalating, now carried an undercurrent of something more. The tension had become its own living thing, and as the last click of a phone echoed through the lobby, the realization hit hard. Things were about to change. What started as a simple check-in had become something much larger, something far more important. It was a test, one that would stretch the very limits of patience and control. David stood in the center of the lobby, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a storm on the horizon, but he didn't flinch. The tension crackled in the air, but he remained a steady force, his posture straight, his eyes focused, unshaken by Rebecca's pointed words. Fragile mask of civility might break. But even as Rebecca's words came faster, sharper, David's presence didn't waver. With every snide remark, his body remained an embodiment of stillness. His hands, tucked calmly in front of him, didn't tremble, though his mind was racing. He was no stranger to this kind of situation. He had encountered these same undercurrents of judgment countless times, small jabs masked as polite conversation, subtle dismissals wrapped in seemingly innocuous comments. But now, in this moment, there was something else simmering beneath his composed exterior. He wasn't just standing there, he was processing everything. The first remark came, a seemingly casual dismissal, the type he had heard before. Rebecca's voice dripped with sarcasm as she repeated his last name, Thompson, the words rolling off her tongue with a hidden sneer. He'd heard it all before, "Your name doesn't sound like it belongs here," and each time, he swallowed the sting without letting it show. His jaw tightened imperceptibly, a flicker in his eyes betraying the briefest flash of emotion. He wasn't just reacting to Rebecca's words. He was remembering the countless times he had stood in front of people like her, people who saw him as less, people who couldn't fathom his success, who couldn't understand that someone like him could belong in a space like this.
With each word, he allowed his breath to slow. His chest rose and fell, controlled, deliberate. This wasn't just about proving he belonged here. This was about more than just one interaction. This was about dismantling years of bias, inch by inch, every time he encountered it. He'd come to understand that in these moments, calmness was his weapon, his shield. He wasn't just trying to stay still, he was recentering himself in the face of a world that had never fully embraced him. His silence was a fortress built from years of experience, of learning how to move through spaces where he was always seen as an outsider. When Rebecca's eyes narrowed and her voice took on a sharper edge, trying to undermine him further, there was no explosion. There was only a slight tightening in the line of David's shoulders, a subtle shift that no one could have seen unless they were paying close attention. His fingers clenched, just for a moment, the only outward sign that her words were landing somewhere deeper than his exterior allowed. The tightness wasn't anger, but something far more complex, an old familiar ache he had spent years learning to ignore. He had been pushed to the brink before, many times. But today was different. This time, he wouldn't let his restraint break. He had come too far for this moment to be defined by someone else's bias. Rebecca leaned in, her posture overtly dismissive, as she questioned his reservation again. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" The words were low but sharp, designed to poke at him, to make him second-guess himself, to make him feel out of place. The room around them seemed to close in. The faint buzz of distant conversations, the clinking of glass, all amplified as if they were punctuating her words. But David didn't flinch. His eyes, though steady, showed something else now, a faint, quiet determination. It was the same resolve that had gotten him through every other moment like this one, a quiet acknowledgement that people like Rebecca would never understand his journey, his fight to be seen as more than what they expected. He didn't respond right away, and that silence seemed to stretch between them. It wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. He was calculating his next move, thinking beyond the moment, thinking about the bigger picture. Every word Rebecca spoke, every condescending look, was merely a reminder of the walls he had to break down. His lips barely parted, but when they did, his words came out not in anger, but with quiet strength. "I'm sure, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The shift in his demeanor was subtle, but undeniable. A slight, almost imperceptible raising of his chin, a breath taken so deep it seemed to anchor him to the floor beneath him. He wasn't just trying to assert his presence. He was reminding her, and everyone in that room, of something much larger. This was about dignity. This was about the quiet, relentless march toward a world that would one day understand that people like him didn't need to fight to belong. They already did. David wasn't just fighting for himself in that moment. His calmness was a reminder to every person who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. It wasn't about confronting Rebecca in a battle of words. It was about showing that his presence alone, his refusal to be moved, was a quiet revolution. The longer he remained composed, the more Rebecca's frustration grew. The silence between them became unbearable, not because David lacked the words,
but because she was slowly realizing that her words had no power over him. His composure was slowly stripping her of her control.
He wasn't simply enduring the moment, he was challenging it. Every time Rebecca tried to escalate, David's stillness became a barrier she couldn't break. And in his calm, he made it clear, he was a force to be reckoned with, not because of how loudly he spoke, but because of the quiet strength that ran through him, unshaken, unwavering, and built on the years of navigating a world that didn't always want him there. The longer David stood there, the more the small details began to weave themselves into a pattern he couldn't ignore. Each glance Rebecca threw at him, each word that passed her lips, felt like a subtle jab, one he had learned to endure over the years. But this time, there was something different about it. It wasn't just her dismissiveness, it was the way she spoke to him, the way her tone shifted when she addressed him compared to the other guests in the lobby. She had greeted the previous guest with a smile that reached her eyes, a tone laced with politeness and respect. But when David stepped up, her smile was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper. There was a distance in her voice, a slight edge that he'd heard so many times before. It wasn't outright hostility, it was more insidious, a polite version of, "I don't belong here," wrapped in the guise of customer service. The way her lips tightened when she spoke his name was barely noticeable, but David caught it. He wasn't imagining it. He knew the difference.
The words she used were carefully chosen, each one dipped in a subtle condescension, like she was speaking to someone she deemed unworthy of her time. "Are you sure this is your reservation, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, emphasizing the last name with an almost mocking cadence. It was a question that didn't need to be asked, not when the confirmation was right in front of her. But her eyes lingered too long on the screen, her fingers hovering just above the keyboard as if she were waiting for something to go wrong. David felt the weight of it, felt the pressure building with each small but significant remark. It wasn't just the tone, it was the way she spoke to him, as though he had somehow disrupted the smooth flow of her day. It was the sharpness in her voice that made his presence feel like an intrusion. And as the minutes ticked by, he began to notice even more, the way she barely made eye contact, the dismissive flick of her wrist when she handed him the key card, the way she avoided speaking directly to him as much as possible. Each of these moments, so small on their own, began to compound in his mind, each one adding to the growing tension between them. David wasn't blind to the weight of these microaggressions. He had learned to recognize them in every corner of his life. This wasn't just about a simple check-in. This was a moment where he was being told in subtle ways that he didn't belong. And every time Rebecca's voice clipped in his direction, every time she looked at him like he was a problem to be solved, a tiny spark of frustration flickered inside him. He swallowed it down, forcing himself to remain calm, but it was there, a pressure that was steadily building, one breath at a time.
As Rebecca continued to ask questions he had already answered, David's gaze shifted slightly. His jaw tightened just the smallest fraction, his eyes narrowing ever so subtly as he processed the growing pattern. She had asked him 3 times about his reservation, each time more pointed, more dismissive. He could feel it, the difference, the way she spoke to him with a slight tilt of her head, as if she were looking down on him without saying a word. It wasn't just about the words she said, it was in her body language too, the way she shifted her weight to one hip, how she barely glanced up from the screen, her posture so cold and indifferent. His fingers, which had been resting lightly on the counter, flexed for a brief moment, the muscles in his hand contracting slightly. It was a small shift, a barely perceptible reaction to the mounting pressure. His thoughts flashed back to the many times he had been in situations like this where everything felt wrong but no one was willing to call it out. In his past, he'd learned to internalize these moments, to let them pass, to keep the peace. But here, in this lobby, with Rebecca's quiet but unmistakable condescension, He felt something shift inside him. He could feel the weight of all the unspoken moments from his past, all the microaggressions that had been dismissed as nothing. David remained still, his outward composure impeccable. But inside, a subtle change was happening. He wasn't just standing there quietly, he was processing, recalculating how to respond. The tension was building, and with every second that Rebecca's words grew sharper, every time she looked at him with that slight air of superiority, it became clearer that he wasn't just being treated differently, he was being told over and over again that he didn't belong. He had been in this position before, felt this sting before, but never quite like this. This time it felt more deliberate.
He had a choice to make: address it directly, or let it simmer, building inside him as it always had. His calmness, his restraint, wasn't born from a desire to avoid conflict. It was a carefully chosen decision to navigate this moment, to allow it to unfold in a way that would hold true to his values. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him rattle. He had fought too long for this moment, for this position, to let her words chip away at his resolve. David's gaze remained steady, unwavering, but there was something more behind his eyes now, something that hadn't been there at the beginning of their exchange. It was a quiet determination, the understanding that he wasn't just a guest in this hotel. He was a force in a world that had long told him to step aside, to shrink, to apologize for taking up space. But not today. Today, he was going to let Rebecca's words wash over him without flinching, without giving her the satisfaction of seeing him break. He would internalize it, process it, but never let it define him. The small details were adding up, and David was ready. He wouldn't let this moment pass unnoticed. As the tension continued to simmer between David and Rebecca, the quiet murmur of the lobby shifted ever so slightly. David's attention, ever observant, caught a few scattered remarks from the surrounding staff and guests. It wasn't loud, but the subtlety of it all spoke volumes. From across the room, he overheard two employees near the coat check, whispering under their breath. The conversation was hushed, but David could hear enough to catch the unmistakable undertone of frustration. One of them, a young woman in uniform, sighed as she folded a jacket. It's always the same with people like him, isn't it? They come in, expecting special treatment, acting like they own the place. Her words, though not directly aimed at him, hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Her colleague, a man with a name tag reading Steve, shook his head but kept his voice low. I don't know why they bother. This stuff always blows over. The guests? They don't care as long as they get what they want. David's eyes flicked briefly toward them. Their exchange wasn't loud enough to be considered a direct confrontation, but the casual dismissal, the air of resignation, painted a picture of something far more insidious. He could feel the weight of their judgment, even if they didn't realize how loudly their words carried. It wasn't just about Rebecca. There was a deeper pattern, an unspoken culture that permeated the hotel, one where certain guests were expected to comply, and others were simply tolerated, quietly marginalized. And it wasn't just an isolated incident. As he continued to wait, the quiet murmur of a guest in the corner caught his attention. An older woman, sitting with her husband, leaned in close to him, speaking just loudly enough for David to hear. This kind of thing happens all the time, you know, she muttered, her voice laced with a mix of exhaustion and apathy. They treat people like him differently. You'd think by now they'd learn how to handle it better, but no, always the same. Her husband nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the scene before them. It's been going on for years, he murmured, barely glancing at David. Nothing changes. It wasn't a loud revelation, but it was a sharp one. The words drifted toward David like a heavy weight, an offhand remark that revealed more than anyone intended. The problem wasn't just Rebecca.
It wasn't just this single exchange. There was something ingrained, a deeper issue buried in the culture of the hotel, a culture that expected certain guests to fall in line while others were simply tolerated, quietly marginalized.
These moments, subtle as they were, painted a broader picture, one where prejudice wasn't just a fluke, but part of the system. And though the staff might dismiss it as an unfortunate but accepted reality, David knew better. The issue ran deeper than he could have anticipated. It wasn't just Rebecca, it was the quiet acceptance of this behavior, the normalizing of bias, the failure to address it head-on. It was part of a bigger problem, one that David wasn't going to let slide by unnoticed. David felt the weight of the moment settling in like an uninvited presence, creeping into the space around him. The once bustling lobby, with its marble floors and polished elegance, suddenly felt vast, empty, distant. Guests who had been casually moving about, lost in their own conversations, now avoided his gaze. They shifted uneasily, stepping around him, as if his presence was an inconvenience they couldn't quite escape. No one stopped to offer help, no one reached out. Instead, they all quietly, subtly veered away, as if somehow they too could feel the pressure that was building, the pressure that wasn't just between David and Rebecca, but between him and the whole room. The space around him seemed to stretch, further and further, until he was standing alone, almost as though the walls of the lobby had slowly closed in around him. The marble walls, gleaming under the fluorescent lights, seemed like a cruel reminder of his isolation. His back was pressed against them now, the cool stone a stark contrast to the heat rising inside him. The smooth surface offered no comfort, no escape. It was as if the walls themselves were reflecting his emotional state, pushing him further into this metaphorical corner, a corner he hadn't walked into voluntarily. His body remained still, composed, an island amidst the growing storm, but the isolation was palpable. Each passing second stretched the tension, and each movement, every sound that pierced the silence, felt like amplified. The buzz of distant conversations, the soft shuffle of shoes on the polished floor, the occasional cough, all of it now felt like an oppressive presence, pushing David into a quiet space of his own. It was as if the lobby, once a place of openness and light, had turned into a claustrophobic trap where the air felt thinner with every passing moment.
David felt it, the weight of it all pressing against him, not just from Rebecca's judgment, but from the unmistakable absence of support. The empty spaces in the hotel, the wide expanses of the lobby now devoid of the warmth he had once expected from a place of hospitality, became a physical manifestation of his emotional isolation. His eyes scanned the room, but no one met his gaze. Even those who had witnessed the exchange avoided his look, their eyes glancing quickly away, as if to avoid acknowledging the truth that was hanging in the air between them. They were complicit in this silence. It was no longer just about Rebecca's treatment of him. It was about the quiet complicity of everyone around him, the subtle way they all shifted just out of his reach, unwilling to challenge what was happening. Inside, David's thoughts began to race. Why was this happening? Why now? The questions churned in his mind, but he didn't allow them to break through his composed exterior. The calm he maintained was no longer a choice. It had become a necessity, the only thing anchoring him in this sea of growing frustration. Yet even as his mind raced, his body remained still, the tension in his muscles building quietly under the surface. The subtle shifts, like the faint tightening of his fingers, the slight clenching of his jaw, were all small signals that the calm he projected was not an accurate reflection of what was happening inside him. A quiet sigh escaped his lips, almost imperceptible, but it was there, proof of the strain beginning to show through. It wasn't the frustration with Rebecca anymore. It was the cumulative weight of years of these moments, these small but undeniable slights. Each dismissive glance, each assumed stereotype had stacked up over time, leaving a pressure that he had learned to suppress but never quite shake. He wanted to stand up, wanted to say something, to challenge her, to challenge the room, but he held back. His hands, still resting by his side, twitched with the urge to do something, anything, to break the tension that was suffocating him. But not yet. He couldn't let them see that. Not now. He had spent years learning how to keep it all inside, how to wear this calm as armor against the world that constantly pushed him to the edge. But the cracks were beginning to show. A shift in his posture, his spine straightening just slightly, a breath that was drawn in a little too deeply, his fist clenched, fingers curling involuntarily, and for the briefest moment, his nails pressed into the palm of his hand, the only physical manifestation of the storm raging inside him.
The question remained, how much longer could he hold on? His mind flicked back to the countless moments in his past when he had been forced to stay silent, when he had been told in countless ways that he was not worthy of the same respect as others. Was this just another moment to endure? Or was this the moment that would break the cycle? His gaze shifted again to Rebecca, and for the first time in the encounter, his eyes locked with hers. Her smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second, as if sensing that David was no longer the passive figure she had expected. His silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't an invitation to keep pushing. It was the calm before a storm. And as that tension in his body rose, the weight of his own inner battle became undeniable. He had been holding back for so long, but now, in this moment, he could feel it. The question was no longer about maintaining his composure. It was about what he would do when that composure finally cracked. The air between them thickened, the room's silence stretching taut. David didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. The storm inside him was already unfolding in ways Rebecca couldn't yet understand. And in that silence, in the calm before the storm, he knew one thing. This moment, this quiet battle, was only just beginning. The lobby, once alive with distant conversations and the soft hum of a busy hotel, now seemed to hold its breath. The tension had reached a boiling point, but the moment hung in a fragile stillness. Guests moved quietly, unsure of what to make of the scene unfolding at the front desk. The space felt heavy, suffocating, each second drawn out as if time itself was waiting for something to happen. The muted sounds of the hotel's ambiance, soft footsteps, the clink of keys, the rustle of papers, seemed far away now. All focus was on the quiet confrontation, and it felt like the weight of the entire room was pressing in on David. Then, in the middle of this charged silence, his phone buzzed. The sound broke through the tension, sharp and sudden, like the crack of a whip. For a moment, no one moved. Even Rebecca, whose attention had been laser-focused on David, hesitated. It was a subtle but telling shift. David, his eyes still locked on hers, reached into his pocket without breaking his composure. His fingers brushed against the phone, and as he pulled it out, the screen illuminated with a name, Michael Brown. The buzz of his phone, the subtle notification seemed to amplify the moment, giving it an almost surreal quality. As David glanced at the screen, a brief silence fell over the lobby. The moment stretched. No one spoke. No one moved. The tension was palpable. David held the phone in his hand, his thumb hovering over the screen as if making a decision. His face remained calm, his expression unreadable, but internally, the weight of what he was about to do hung heavily in the air.
His voice, when he finally spoke, cut through the silence with quiet authority. "Michael," he said, his tone even, composed. The calmness in his voice contrasted sharply with the mounting panic that was bubbling up from the staff. The guests in the lobby, their eyes darting nervously from David to Rebecca, seemed to sense that something was shifting, something big was about to happen, and they were all caught in the undertow of it.
Rebecca, still standing behind the counter, could feel the shift in the air. Her chest tightened, her pulse quickened. For the briefest moment, the smug confidence she had been clinging to faltered. She hadn't expected this, didn't know how to react to the calmness with which David spoke. His composure only made the moment more intense, more dangerous. It was as if David had been in control all along, and Rebecca had just failed to realize it. Her gaze flicked nervously between David and the phone in his hand, her lips pressing into a thin line. David's voice was still steady as he spoke into the phone, but Rebecca couldn't hear the words. All she knew was that something was happening, something that was slipping out of her control. Her breath quickened, her throat tight, and the corners of her vision began to blur. She took a step back from the counter, eyes flicking around as if she could find a way to save face, to pull herself back into a position of power. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice suddenly trembling, breaking the silence in an awkward rush. I didn't realize." Her words stumbled, faltering as she tried to regain control, but the panic was already creeping into her voice. There was an edge of desperation in her tone now, the same tone she had used earlier to dismiss him, now cracking under the weight of the truth she hadn't seen coming. She forced a smile, her lips trembling, but it was hollow, empty. "I can explain. I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" David didn't look at her as he spoke. His focus remained on the phone, and his quiet authority seemed to strip the air of any pretense of politeness. The longer Rebecca spoke, the more her words seemed to fall apart, her voice growing increasingly frantic. The realization hit her like a slap to the face, and she tried to recover, her hands trembling as she reached for her own phone, as if she could somehow reverse the situation, undo the damage. But nothing she said could cover up the crack in her facade.
"No, you don't understand," she said, her voice now rising in pitch, her attempt at control slipping further away. This isn't how I—" She stopped herself mid-sentence, eyes flicking around the room, her panic evident to anyone who had been paying attention. Her lips parted, as if searching for the right words, but they never came. Each pause between her sentences grew longer, her desperation growing clearer. She tried to explain herself, but the words only seemed to make her lose her grip more. It was as if she was watching her carefully constructed world crumble before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The silence that followed her words was deafening. The room held its breath as Rebecca's composure continued to slip, her movements becoming more erratic. The calmness in David's demeanor only intensified the sense of unease. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't even made a direct accusation. But with every word that Rebecca stammered, the truth became undeniable. She had misjudged him, and now the power in the room had shifted. David, still speaking softly into the phone, was a study in calmness. The deeper he delved into the conversation with Michael, the more Rebecca's facade crumbled. His voice, even and authoritative, was the anchor in a storm of her own making. Rebecca's hands shook as she fumbled with her phone, trying to cover her tracks, but it was too late. The room had already witnessed the shift, felt the change in the air. "Please," Rebecca muttered, barely audible, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to—" But the damage was done. And in the silence that followed, with the weight of the truth hanging heavily between them, it was clear to everyone in the lobby that the mask had slipped, and Rebecca was no longer in control. The shift in the air was immediate. As the words left David's mouth, the entire atmosphere in the lobby seemed to freeze. There was a collective tension, a sudden hush that swept through the space, as if time had slowed to allow for the realization to settle in. The calmness in David's voice contrasted starkly with the growing panic beneath the surface of Rebecca's increasingly frantic attempts to salvage her composure. But it wasn't just Rebecca who felt the weight of the moment. Across the room, the reactions of the other hotel staff were equally telling. Michael, the general manager, had been standing near the entrance, engaged in a quiet conversation with a colleague. His head snapped around at the mention of David's name. The briefest flicker of recognition crossed his face, a momentary flash of confusion that was quickly masked by professionalism. But it didn't take long for the truth to settle in. His eyes darted back to David, widening with disbelief, then flicked over to Rebecca, whose own demeanor was unraveling. Michael's expression shifted in an instant. His jaw tightened and his hands clenched at his sides, as if he were trying to process what had just happened. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a fleeting second, he was paralyzed by the weight of it. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. The usual calm authority that Michael exuded was gone, replaced by a deep, underlying fear he couldn't conceal. His gaze locked with Rebecca's, but she was too caught in her own panic to notice him. Behind Michael, Lisa, the head of HR, had been reviewing some documents near the front desk. The sound of David's voice, firm and resolute, made her pause, her pen halting mid-motion. She looked up, her eyes narrowing as she processed the conversation. It took only a split second for the realization to dawn on her, but it hit with the same force as a cold wind. Lisa's mouth opened slightly as though she was about to speak, but she closed it quickly, her eyes flicking nervously toward Michael, who was clearly shaken. A subtle tremor ran through her fingers as she set the papers down, her earlier professionalism slipping away. The facade of composure she had built up in the corporate world was now showing cracks, revealing the fear simmering just beneath the surface. She looked around, her face paling, and for a moment her gaze met David's, and she quickly looked away, as if she'd been caught in something far bigger than herself. The reactions were subtle, but they were there. Michael's stiff posture, Lisa's quick glance toward the door, their attempts to regain control of the situation only fueling the sense of dread. The shift in the power dynamic was undeniable. This was no longer just about David standing up for himself. It was about the entire foundation of the hotel's culture beginning to crack. The employees were realizing, perhaps for the first time, just how far their own biases had been allowed to flourish, unchallenged. And then, the camera moved slowly, deliberately, from the staff to Rebecca. Her earlier composure, her smug confidence, seemed to evaporate with each passing second. The weight of David's words, his calm revelation of his identity, settled around her like a heavy blanket, smothering her once invincible posture. The frame tightened around her, pushing her closer to the counter, forcing her to shrink under the weight of her own actions. Her hand, once confidently resting on the counter, now fumbled with the edges of the keycards, her fingers twitching as if they no longer had control. Her gaze flicked up to meet David's, but the firmness she had once held was gone, replaced by a frantic desperation to undo the damage she had done. She was losing control, and the walls were closing in on her. David, standing there, his presence unwavering, calmly turned his attention back to the phone in his hand. The room seemed to fall quieter, as if the very space around them had absorbed the tension, leaving only the faint sound of his voice cutting through the silence. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't demanding, he was simply speaking, his words measured, deliberate, and full of quiet authority. With each passing second, the contrast between David's composed demeanor and Rebecca's crumbling facade became even more stark. His voice, calm and controlled, only heightened the sense of dread that was growing within her. The tension in the air was now unbearable, the atmosphere thick with the weight of what had just been revealed.
Rebecca's eyes darted between Michael and Lisa, seeking someone, anyone to help her. But no one moved. No one intervened. It was as though the room itself had frozen, its silence echoing with the realization that Rebecca was now the one under scrutiny.
She was the one who had overstepped, and no matter how much she tried to explain herself, it was clear that the power had shifted irrevocably. David, still speaking into the phone, seemed untouched by the chaos unfolding around him. His calmness in the face of Rebecca's unraveling made the moment even more dramatic. The room, the situation, everything was under his control now. And Rebecca, who had once been the authority, was now a bystander to her own collapse, unable to reverse the tide that had turned against her. The camera lingered on her for a moment, her face flushed with embarrassment and panic. The weight of her mistake, her assumption, was too much to hide now. She had misjudged him, underestimated him, and now the truth was out. The silence was deafening as David's quiet strength enveloped the room, his calmness a testament to everything she had failed to see. David stood still, his posture unshaken. But inside, the weight of the moment was undeniable. The silence around him felt suffocating, and as he processed the situation, it became clear that this wasn't just about the confrontation with Rebecca. This was a moment of realization, a stark confrontation with the truth that the issues he had faced in silence for so long weren't isolated incidents. The magnitude of it hit him slowly, settling into his bones as his breath deepened, more to steady himself than to calm the storm inside him. His gaze wandered, but his mind was elsewhere, processing everything, the years of small battles fought quietly in the background, each moment leading to this. His thoughts drifted back to every time he had been dismissed, every time his worth was questioned. It wasn't just one woman at a front desk. It was the culmination of countless invisible moments that had slowly but surely worn down the walls of tolerance he had built around himself.
The tension between them was palpable. Michael, desperate to salvage something, glanced at Lisa, but his uncertainty was clear. The unity that had once seemed to hold them together was splintering. "We need to fix this now," he muttered, barely audible, though no one seemed to know what he was referring to. Every time he attempted to speak, his words only seemed to make the situation worse. The staff's facade of professionalism cracked with every word they spoke. Rebecca, trying in vain to regain some sense of control, turned to Janet, who had been standing quietly by the door. "Janet, you need to—" Rebecca started, but the words were swallowed by the mounting realization that no one was coming to her rescue. Janet shifted uncomfortably, her body language tight with unease, unsure of where to turn. Michael's eyes flitted nervously between Rebecca and the growing group of guests who were now witnessing the unraveling. The once contained panic in the room now felt like an unstoppable force, and no amount of scrambling would contain it. David, still a steady presence amidst the chaos, watched as the staff fumbled, each trying to salvage their own reputation while the bigger issue remained. The breakdown wasn't just happening between Rebecca and him, it was happening across the entire staff, and it was clear to everyone in the lobby that something deeper was at play. The air was thick with the realization that this wasn't a one-time incident, but a failure within the system itself, one that they could no longer ignore. As the tension continued to rise, David remained composed, watching the staff's growing desperation. He hadn't moved. He hadn't shouted. His stillness, in contrast to the floundering panic around him, was the final nail in the coffin. Rebecca's attempts to explain herself, her words now increasingly hollow, only highlighted how far out of control the situation had gone. The power dynamic, once so firmly in her hands, was now in his, and she knew it.
The air in the lobby shifted once again, this time with a subtle but unmistakable new pressure. David could feel it before he even heard the sound, the click of a phone camera shutter, followed by the soft whir of a recording beginning. He had expected it, of course. The world didn't allow moments like these to slip by unnoticed, not anymore. The media presence, though indirect, was now a part of the equation.
like an invisible force pressing in on the already fragile situation. The guests who had been standing idly by, pretending not to notice, had suddenly become silent participants, their phones rising like modern-day weapons. One by one, the phones came out, the bright screens illuminating faces that had once been casual observers. The first phone's camera was discreet, but the second was more overt, held high, angled just so that it captured the unfolding drama in its full, high-definition detail. The clicks became more frequent, and as the number of cameras grew, so did the unease in David's chest. He could feel the weight of the moment turning from a personal confrontation into something much bigger, something out of his control. He had become the subject of a spectacle, the quiet exchange between him and Rebecca, now a public performance, being captured for all to see. The reality of what was happening hit him like a wave. The stakes had shifted. The phones, pointed directly at him, turned this into a moment of judgment, not just from Rebecca and the hotel staff, but from the world. Every captured frame now carried the potential for consequences David hadn't fully anticipated. The videos would spread, dissected and shared, spun into something far beyond this lobby, far beyond this moment. The entire episode was slipping into the hands of a public who would soon form their own opinions, their own judgments, without ever truly understanding the full context.
The more footage was recorded, the more intense the consequences felt. The guests who had been silently watching, their discomfort growing as they witnessed the collapse of Rebecca's professionalism, now became the driving force behind the escalation. It wasn't just about him standing his ground anymore. It was about something much larger. David, ever aware of the camera lenses focused on him, couldn't ignore the growing isolation he felt. The more attention the incident garnered, the more it pushed him into the spotlight, leaving him standing alone at the center of it all. He wasn't just isolated physically by the distance the staff kept, but emotionally too. The weight of being the focal point of everyone's eyes, their phones, their judgments, made him feel like an actor in a drama he hadn't signed up for. The lobby was no longer just a space for luxury and relaxation. It had transformed into a stage, and David, the unwitting protagonist, was now playing a role he hadn't prepared for. He had always dealt with scrutiny, with being an outsider, but this was different. There was no escaping it. The recordings would be everywhere, and his face, caught in that moment, would be out there for the world to see. The pressure mounted with every click, every phone raised, until it felt like the walls were closing in. And then, for the briefest moment, David considered walking away. He stood there, eyes briefly drifting to the doors, and for a fleeting second, the thought crossed his mind. Let it go. Let the situation escalate on its own. He could leave now, let the staff sort out their own mess. They had created this chaos. They had let it build. He could step away, walk out of the lobby, and remove himself from the equation entirely. The weight of the moment, the external pressure, and the growing sense that this wasn't a battle he was prepared to fight, crept into his mind. The world didn't need to know everything that had led to this point. It didn't need to understand the years of quiet suffering that had pushed him to this moment. The thought lingered, tempting him with the promise of peace, of avoiding the fallout. But just as quickly, the possibility began to fade. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the cameras, the judgment, the eyes of the room all pressing in on him. The reality settled in. Walking away wasn't an option anymore. This wasn't just about this moment, or about Rebecca. This was bigger.
His fingers clenched at his sides, the tension rising in his chest. He wasn't just standing here for himself. He was standing here for everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or made to feel small. The pressure had already been building for so long, and now it was coming to a head. If he walked away now, if he let the injustice go unchallenged, he would be complicit in the system that had held him and others back for so long. David took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He wasn't here just to be a passive observer. He wasn't here to be a footnote in someone else's story. He wasn't going to let the cameras or the world dictate his response. His decision was made, not with anger, but with purpose. He stood his ground, no longer thinking of the repercussions. The pressure from the outside world no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered now was facing this moment with dignity, knowing that whatever came next, he had chosen to stand up. The cameras continued to click, but now, David's calmness in the face of it all was a quiet defiance. It was his choice to be here, to face this moment head-on. And in that quiet, determined stand, he reclaimed control, not just of the situation, but of himself. David stepped back from the chaos, just for a moment, and let the sounds of the hotel fade away. The cameras, the hushed whispers of guests, the frantic movements of the staff, all of it seemed to blur into a muffled hum as he pulled himself into the quiet of his own thoughts. He stood alone for the first time in this entire exchange, his back to the marble wall that had held him in place for so long. It wasn't just the physical isolation, it was the space he had created within himself, the one he had retreated to in moments of overwhelming pressure. Here, in this small pocket of stillness, he could finally hear his own voice. A soft vibration pulled him from his thoughts. David looked at his phone screen, seeing the name Michael Brown flash across the display. For a moment he hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen as the weight of everything, Rebecca's condescension, the eyes of the room on him, pressed down once more. But then he pressed accept, his grip tightening on the phone as his thumb moved to his ear. Michael's voice, calm but laced with concern, greeted him on the other side. David cut him off gently, his voice still steady despite the chaos that had led him here.
Michael, David said, his tone more firm than it had been moments before. The weight of the situation settled in as he allowed himself to speak freely, to speak in the way he knew he needed to. This wasn't just about Rebecca or this one incident. This is bigger. It's been building for a long time, hasn't it? There was a pause, and Michael's voice faltered slightly. I've tried to help steer things in the right direction, but David's eyes lifted, his gaze distant now, focused on something beyond the walls of the hotel. We've spent so much time trying to maintain appearances to make sure we're seen as the perfect company. But that's not enough anymore. Not for me, and not for the people we're supposed to serve. His voice softened as he spoke, the weariness of the past few days, weeks, maybe even years, bleeding through. He had always known that change took time, but in this moment he was realizing something crucial. Change wasn't just about time, it was about action, and it was about doing the right thing even when it was difficult. His voice carried the weight of that clarity, a subtle shift from the earlier tension in his body. Michael, David said again, his voice quieter now. It's not enough to play it safe. I've let this go on for too long, trying to stay above the fray, but that stops now. David's hand, which had been clenching the phone tightly, relaxed just slightly. His shoulders, which had been tense and drawn in, dropped. The weariness that had been buried deep inside him, the kind of weariness that made him doubt if he was enough, if he was doing enough, began to lift. The conversation with Michael didn't just reaffirm his thoughts, it gave him the clarity to see what he had to do next. His resolve had always been steady, but now it felt sharper, more focused.
His core values, the ones that had driven him from the very beginning, began to come into clearer view. This was never just about luxury hotels or high-end service. It was about creating a space where everyone, regardless of who they were, felt like they belonged. He wasn't going to walk away from that vision anymore. He was going to fight for it, no matter the cost. The conversation with Michael ended, But the realization had already set in. His body, which had been rigid with tension, now felt lighter. The decision had been made. He wasn't going to let this moment slip by, not without taking control. As the phone call ended, David's mind shifted, and with it came a flashback. One from years ago, long before he had ever stepped foot in this hotel. He remembered the first time he had fought for what was right, when his voice had been smaller, when the system had felt bigger than him. He had been working at a small company back then, a position that many might have dismissed as insignificant. But one afternoon, a colleague had made a comment, a joke really, that wasn't just casual, but discriminatory. He remembered sitting there, hearing those words, and feeling his chest tighten. He was just starting out, just trying to prove himself, and yet something inside him snapped. David hadn't said much then. He'd gone to his boss privately, told him how he felt about the comment, about the larger issue of exclusion that was beginning to rear its head. The response was predictable: silence, a brush-off. It wasn't until he had stood firm and said, "This will not stand in a company I'm a part of," that the boss finally took notice. The conversation led to a meeting. Changes were made. And even if the moment felt small to others, it was a pivotal moment for David. It had been the first time he stood up, not just for himself, but for everyone who didn't have the voice or courage to do so.
The memory was vivid now, sharpening his resolve. He had always been a quiet force, letting his actions speak for themselves. But this moment, this one, was different. He wasn't going to let the system's biases continue unchecked. The weight of the realization settled into him deeply. He wasn't just a participant anymore. He had a responsibility. This wasn't just about one argument, one incident, or one person. It was about fighting for justice, for what was right, and making sure that things changed for good. David took a slow breath, feeling the resolve settle deeper into his bones. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued him moments ago were gone. He had made his choice. Now he was ready to stand firm, no matter what it took. This wasn't just about changing Rebecca's mind. It was about changing the entire culture of the company he had worked so hard to build. As the realization hit him, David's posture straightened, his mind no longer clouded by doubt. His fight for what was right, what he had fought for all those years, was only just beginning, and this time, he was ready. It wasn't just the external pressure, the cameras, or the uncertainty of what was coming next. It was the quiet realization that he was no longer just a participant in this moment. He was the catalyst for change. The truth settled in his chest, heavy but resolute. This wasn't just about Rebecca. It wasn't just about one confrontation, one mistake. It was about reshaping something much larger, something that had been broken for far too long. The culture of this hotel, its very foundation, needed to be torn down and rebuilt. The quiet, reflective moment he had given himself, just a few moments to pause and breathe, allowed the clarity to wash over him. He knew that if he didn't act now, if he didn't do what was needed, the cycle would continue, just like it always had. He wasn't going to let that happen. David pulled his phone from his pocket again. This time, it wasn't to make a call. It was to send a text, a simple message that reinforced the resolve now burning in him. His fingers hovered over the keys as he typed, his eyes focused with a quiet intensity. Time to shift this. We're not just fixing one thing, we're fixing everything. He hit send, his thumb lingering over the screen for a moment, as if the very action of sending those words cemented the truth in his mind. He wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. As he pocketed the phone, David felt a shift, something deep inside him. His thoughts were clearer now, sharper. The weariness from before, the doubt, the hesitation, they were gone. In their place was a quiet determination, one that had been building, deep within him, since he had first stepped foot in this hotel. He wasn't just angry anymore. He wasn't just reacting. He had found purpose. The weight of the situation wasn't just an external pressure anymore. It was the weight of responsibility. He had to be the one to change things. David took a long breath, the air in his lungs steadying him. He could feel it now, the weight of what he needed to do. He had always been the type to lead from the background, to let his actions speak for themselves. But today, it was different. Today, his actions needed to speak louder than ever.
As he slowly turned back to face the lobby, his body language changed. His shoulders straightened, his chest lifted, and his head tilted just slightly higher. It wasn't an act, it was a transformation. The quiet strength that had been simmering beneath the surface now emerged in full force. The stillness of his posture now radiated with confidence. His resolve, clearer than ever, was written in every line of his body. His eyes, once distant and contemplative, were now locked on Rebecca, who was still trying to regain control of the situation. But David wasn't looking at her in anger. He was looking at her with a quiet purpose, understanding that this moment was a turning point, not just for her, but for everything he had worked toward. He didn't say anything just yet. Instead, he let his presence speak. As he began to walk toward the front desk, his movements were deliberate, steady. The shift in his physicality was striking. He was no longer weighed down by uncertainty. His steps were measured, confident, each one reinforcing the clarity of his decision. The slight hum in the air, the murmurs from the staff, seemed to fade as he approached. His focus was now entirely on what was to come. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reclamation of everything he had built, of everything he had sacrificed. David stopped in front of Rebecca, who had been trying to pull herself together, but the moment she saw him approach, the tension between them shifted again. Rebecca looked up, her eyes widening as she took in the quiet power radiating from David. For the first time in their exchange, David wasn't just a guest. He was a force to be reckoned with, a leader who had finally stepped into his own power. Rebecca, still standing behind the counter, visibly recoiled at the transformation. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The familiar air of control she once held slipped away from her with each passing second. David's voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. "This isn't just about you and me, Rebecca. This is about what's been allowed to happen here for far too long. The way things have been done, this ends now." His words hung in the air like a challenge, but there was no anger in his tone, no accusation. There was only truth, and it was undeniable. He wasn't just confronting Rebecca, he was confronting the culture that allowed people like her to thrive, unchecked, for so long. In that moment, David felt a shift in the air. His quiet strength had become a force that the room couldn't ignore. The staff around them, who had been uncertain, now seemed to stand a little straighter, their eyes widening in response to David's resolve. There was no going back now. David had stepped forward, literally and figuratively, and with that, the power dynamic had changed completely. The weight of his decision, the clarity in his actions, filled the room, and for the first time in a long while, David felt the surge of something that had been absent for far too long: hope. This moment was just the beginning, but in this space, at this time, David was finally ready to do what needed to be done.
The atmosphere in the lobby had shifted again. No longer was it filled with the hum of distant conversations or the soft clink of coffee cups. It was now thick with anticipation, each second dragging on, suffocating in its silence. David stood before Rebecca, his gaze steady, unwavering, like a storm waiting to break. There was no hint of rage in his posture, no explosive outburst. His calmness now held the weight of a decision made, not just for him, but for everyone in the room. Rebecca, standing behind the counter, tried to square her shoulders, but there was a tremble in her hands. Her earlier bravado had long since evaporated, replaced with a nervous energy she couldn't hide. Her lips moved as if to speak, but her voice faltered. She tried to straighten her back, to regain some sense of control, but it was too late. The power dynamic had shifted. David wasn't the man who had just walked into this hotel. He was now the force commanding the room, and everyone in it felt the weight of it. David's voice broke the silence, his words measured and deliberate, but each one hit with the precision of a hammer. "You've crossed a line today, Rebecca. The way you've treated me and others like me, this is not how we do things here, and it never will be again." His tone was calm, almost detached, as if the decision had already been made long before this moment. You had the chance to fix this, but instead, you chose to push it further, and now there are consequences. Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her eyes flicked nervously to Michael and Lisa, and then back to David, but nothing came out. She shifted on her feet, trying to regain composure, but it was clear. The power she once held was slipping away with every second. David's gaze never wavered. "You're dismissed, Rebecca. Effective immediately." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had fought for: justice, fairness, and the truth. The finality of it hung in the air like a sharp blade.
Rebecca's face drained of color as she took a step back, her mouth opening and closing in disbelief. You can't just do this," she stammered, her voice trembling. Her hands were shaking now, and her posture had gone from defensive to entirely broken. The confidence she had exuded earlier had been shattered by one simple, irreversible command. I've been here for years. I've done everything you asked." David's voice cut through her panic, unwavering. "You've been part of the problem for years, Rebecca, and now you'll face the consequences of your actions." His words weren't harsh. They were delivered with the calm authority of someone who had seen enough, who had made the hard decisions time and time again. This was justice, plain and simple. Rebecca's mouth went dry as she looked around, the staff now silent and watching, their eyes flicking between David and her. She was no longer in control. "But this isn't fair," she cried, her voice rising in desperation. But it was too late. David wasn't listening anymore. He turned his gaze toward Steve, standing at the back of the room, shifting uncomfortably. The weight of David's stare was enough to freeze him in place. "Steve," David said calmly, his eyes narrowing, "you're suspended, effective immediately. I need you to leave the premises." Steve's body stiffened, his face paling as his hand reached for the collar of his shirt, the fabric suddenly too tight around his neck. "What? You can't. This is ridiculous." His voice cracked as he spoke, the defensiveness dripping from each word. "I didn't do anything. This isn't right."
David remained unaffected, his expression still as calm as it had been when he first stepped forward. "You've been complicit in this culture, Steve. Your behavior has contributed to the toxic environment here, and now you'll have to answer for it." Steve's reaction was immediate, his face contorted in a mix of shock and anger. "You can't just... This is insane. I've been here longer than anyone. This isn't how it works." His body language was frantic now, his arms flailing as he took a step forward, but no one moved to stop him. The room was silent, waiting. David didn't flinch. "No, this is how it works now." He turned to Lisa,
who had been standing off to the side, watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort. "Lisa," David continued, his voice quiet but firm, "this hotel needs immediate reform. You're going to begin restructuring the team, starting with a full review of all hiring and management practices. This culture doesn't change overnight, but it starts now." Lisa nodded slowly, her face pale, eyes wide. She had always been the one to enforce the rules, but now, it was clear, she was facing a choice. "Yes, David," she whispered, but it was clear she wasn't fully prepared for what was coming. She hadn't expected things to unravel so completely. As David's words lingered in the air, the gravity of what had just transpired began to settle on everyone in the room. Rebecca, her body now hunched in defeat, her voice barely a whisper, mumbled, "This isn't over." David stood tall, unshaken, his eyes steady as he looked down at her. "It is over, Rebecca, for you and for the system you've upheld." His gaze shifted to the rest of the staff, and for the first time, they were all fully aware that this was a turning point. There was no going back from this. The emotional weight of the moment hit them all differently. Rebecca stood frozen, her eyes wide, the full realization of what had happened sinking in. She wasn't just losing her job, she was losing the facade of control she had hidden behind for so long. Michael, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke up, his voice quiet but trembling. "David, I didn't know," but the words trailed off. There was nothing left to say.
As the staff began to disperse, the air in the room thick with unspoken tension, David remained in place, still resolute. The weight of the decision, the weight of the justice he had just delivered, wasn't lost on him. This was the beginning of something new. It was painful, it was necessary, and it was just. David had finally stepped into the role he had always known he was meant to fill. He wasn't just running a hotel, he was changing the world inside it. The room grew quieter as the finality of David's actions settled over the staff. The consequences had been delivered, and with them came a heavy silence, a silence that echoed with the weight of justice. The lobby was no longer a place of luxury and quiet elegance. It had become a stage for something far greater. David's words rang out like a bell, each syllable carrying the weight of the moment, reverberating through the marble floors, through the walls of the hotel. The camera lingered on the faces of the staff, each one now stripped of their composure, their earlier arrogance and uncertainty replaced by something far more profound: fear, guilt, and a deep, unspoken recognition. Rebecca, still standing behind the front desk, was the first to feel the shift. Her eyes were wide, her body rigid as she absorbed David's words, his dismissal of her, the irrevocable change that was coming. But it wasn't just her that was crumbling in that moment. Michael, Steve, Lisa, each of them stood in stunned silence, their faces paling with each announcement David made. The camera zoomed in on their expressions, the raw emotion visible in their eyes as they processed what was happening. For the first time, they realized just how much they had ignored, how much they had allowed to slide. The veil had been lifted, and there was no turning back.
David stood taller now, his shoulders squared, his voice unwavering as he spoke to the room, to the guests who had witnessed it all. He wasn't just speaking to Rebecca or the staff. He was speaking to everyone who had ever been complicit in maintaining a broken system. This isn't just about one incident, one person. This is about the culture we've allowed to thrive here, unchecked, for far too long. This is about every guest who has been treated with disrespect, every employee who has been overlooked or mistreated. It stops now. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. The staff shifted uncomfortably, their heads hanging lower as each word landed like a hammer strike. David's gaze swept over them, unyielding. His focus was not just on the individuals who had failed, but on the system itself. The system that had fostered complacency, allowed bias to fester, and made this moment inevitable. He wasn't just addressing their failures, he was challenging the very structure that had allowed those failures to persist. Rebecca, your actions today are a reflection of the deeper issues we've ignored. Michael, Steve, your silence is complicit. Lisa, your role in maintaining this culture ends today. Change will begin immediately, and it will start with accountability. David continued, his voice firm but not angry. His tone was calm, deliberate. He was in control. Effective immediately, we will undergo a full review of all our hiring practices, management policies, and training procedures. This will be an inclusive process, one that prioritizes fairness, respect, and integrity. Every member of this team will be held accountable for their actions, and from here on out, we will build a new standard, a better standard. The old ways will not be tolerated. David's words were not just a reprimand, they were a call to action. There are no exceptions. No one is above this. And for those who cannot align with these changes, your time here is over. His voice was quiet, but the finality in his tone made it clear that there was no room for negotiation. The room grew colder with each word, the heavy silence accentuating the seriousness of the shift that was happening before their eyes. And then, as David took a step forward, his gaze sweeping across the room, his words took on a different tone, a tone that carried hope, resolve, and a deep-seated belief in what was possible. We have the power to change this, to create a place where everyone feels valued, where every person is treated with respect. But that change starts with us. It starts now.
As his words echoed through the room, there was a shift, not just in the staff, but in the very air. It felt like the room was exhaling, the weight of years of tension lifting, if only just a little. The tension between David and the staff was palpable, but in this moment it was clear. David was in control. His vision for the future wasn't just about punishing those who had wronged him. It was about rebuilding something better, something that would last. The staff was silent now. No one spoke, no one moved. The realization was settling in. The consequences were inevitable, and the weight of justice was heavy in the air. But there was something else, a flicker of something in their eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the accountability they had avoided for so long. David's eyes, now locked with Rebecca's, conveyed not anger, but a sense of finality. This was his moment, his responsibility. He had fought for too long to let this be swept under the rug. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for everyone who had been marginalized, for everyone who had been overlooked. And in that moment, with the power dynamic irrevocably shifted, the air thick with the weight of change, David knew one thing. Justice had been served. The truth had come to light, and the room was finally, irrevocably changing. The hum of activity in the hotel was now different. There was a renewed energy, a quiet shift that had taken root after David's decisive actions. The chaos that once seemed inescapable had given way to something far more deliberate, something hopeful. The camera might not capture every individual moment, but the impact of David's choices was unmistakable. Employees who had once been distant or unsure now engaged with each other with a sense of purpose. Staff members from the front desk to housekeeping were seen in training sessions, learning how to interact with guests in ways that were both professional and deeply respectful. The old ways of passive tolerance were replaced by an active commitment to inclusivity. The lessons were hard-fought but necessary. The training wasn't just about protocols, it was about culture, about making sure everyone felt welcomed, heard, and valued.
Behind the scenes, new hires, carefully selected through a rigorous, fair process, embodied the inclusive culture David had championed. They walked through the hallways with the understanding that they weren't just filling a position, they were part of a vision that demanded dignity for everyone. Their attitudes reflected the subtle but profound changes that were sweeping through the hotel. They didn't need to be told what to do, they already knew. The guests, too, felt the difference. David noticed it in the smiles of those checking in the way they looked at the staff, no longer as faces behind a counter, but as people who saw them as human beings. There was a shift in the atmosphere. The hotel had become what David had always wanted it to be, a place where everyone could feel at home, no matter their background, where inclusivity wasn't just a catchphrase, but a living, breathing practice. The progress was tangible, undeniable. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but the foundations had been laid. David couldn't help but notice the shift in the way people carried themselves. Staff, guests, even the occasional regular. There was a sense of belonging that hadn't been there before. Later, after the rush had settled and the day had wound down, David found himself back in the lobby, standing quietly, taking it all in. The bustling activity, the friendly interactions, the laughter that echoed faintly from the dining area, all of it felt different now. His vision, which had once seemed so distant, was now unfolding before him, and the transformation was palpable.
He leaned against the same marble wall where everything had started, allowing the hum of the hotel to wash over him. The energy in the air felt lighter, the tension that had once hung in the space gone. The change had taken root. It was real. David closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling the weight of the decision he had made, knowing that it had altered the trajectory not only of the hotel, but of the people within it. There was a stillness now, one of calm satisfaction, but also of purpose. He had done what he set out to do, not for recognition, but for something far more lasting. When he opened his eyes again, it wasn't with the same uncertainty he had felt before. His resolve, the vision that had once felt so fragile, was now tangible, solidified in the actions that had unfolded over the last few weeks. It wasn't just about what he had changed, it was about the new foundation that had been built. And in this quiet moment, with the hotel moving seamlessly around him, David could finally relax, knowing that the hard work, the sacrifices, and the struggle had sparked a true transformation. This was just the beginning, but it was a beginning that felt like a victory. And for the first time in a long time, David stood there, unburdened, knowing that what he had fought for had taken root and change had been set into motion. David sat with his team in the quiet of the conference room, the soft hum of the hotel in the background, a stark contrast to the intensity of the conversation that had just unfolded. It was a new kind of meeting, one where the weight of the past was finally being addressed, and the future felt open, filled with possibilities. Michael, who had initially been uncertain about the changes, now sat with a more measured calmness. His earlier anxiety had faded, replaced by a genuine sense of pride. "You know," he started, his voice steady, "when we first started talking about accountability, I wasn't sure it would work. I thought it might break us. But instead, it's brought us together. People are more engaged, they're showing up differently. And honestly, the atmosphere in this place has changed. People feel more like they belong." He looked at David, a sense of quiet admiration in his eyes. "You led us through the hard part, the part that no one else was willing to face." David nodded, acknowledging the compliment, but his expression remained focused. "It's not about me," he said, simply. "It's about the work we all did together. Everyone here took responsibility for what was wrong, and it's that willingness to confront the truth that's allowed us to grow." His voice carried the weight of the journey they had been through.
a quiet strength that spoke not only of the changes they had made, but the unity they had found along the way.
Lisa, who had once been hesitant to embrace the level of reform David had proposed, now looked at the group with renewed purpose. I've seen it too. I've seen how the staff is more connected to what we're building here. The team is stronger. There's a sense of pride now that I haven't seen before. The way people treat each other, the way we approach guests, it's different. It's like we've all realized that this hotel isn't just a place to work. It's a place where we're all creating something bigger. And it's because we stopped pretending and we started really seeing the issues that had been holding us back. The room fell into a brief silence, and David's gaze swept over his team, appreciating the quiet understanding between them. He had always known that accountability was key, but hearing it from them, their acknowledgement of the growth they had experienced, the strength they had found in facing the truth, was more powerful than any success he had imagined when he first took the position. "You all made it possible," David said, his voice calm but filled with appreciation. "It wasn't just about me making decisions or laying out plans. It was about each of you being willing to step up, to have those tough conversations, to challenge what wasn't working. That's what made this hotel stronger." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I've always believed in this place. I've always believed in what it could be, if we just gave it the space to be right. And we've done that. Together." The room was filled with quiet reflection, but there was an undercurrent of optimism in the air, a renewed sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. Michael leaned forward, a smile tugging at his lips. "You were right. The hard conversations, the accountability, they've made us better. We're not just surviving anymore. We're thriving." David's gaze softened. "And that's just the beginning," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "It's about more than keeping up appearances. It's about truly creating the kind of environment we've always talked about. One where everyone feels respected, where they can be their authentic selves, and where accountability isn't just a buzzword. It's a living, breathing part of our culture. That's what we're building here."
As the conversation continued, the team discussed the next steps, the new initiatives, the ongoing training, the feedback loops that would continue to foster the inclusivity and transparency that had become the backbone of their work. But even more than the logistics, there was a quiet understanding in the room that this wasn't just a shift in policy. It was a shift in their approach to leadership, to people, to the culture they created day in and day out. The conversation slowed, each of them silently contemplating the depth of the changes they had witnessed, and the work still left to be done. But amid it all, there was a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. They had faced what was uncomfortable, and through that discomfort, they had grown. As the meeting came to an end, David stood from his seat, his mind already turning toward the next steps. But before he left the room, he took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. The crisis that had threatened to tear them apart had, instead, brought them closer together. They had faced their flaws head-on, and through that honesty, they had built something stronger, more resilient. Outside, the hotel buzzed with activity, but inside, David stood still for a moment, watching the team disperse, knowing that the journey they had started wasn't over. It was a journey of constant growth, of always doing better, but it was a journey that had given him hope for the future. Hope that real change, lasting change, was possible when people were willing to step up and face what needed to be faced.
In this quiet moment, David understood something deeper. The fight for justice, for what was right, was never about a single victory. It was about the ongoing work of building something better, together. And with that realization, he knew he had started a movement, one that would continue to ripple out, touching lives and creating opportunities for change far beyond the walls of this hotel. Real change was possible.
It was a choice, and David had made it. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.